The year was 1692, and in the remote valleys of the Scottish Highlands, near the abandoned village of Culderock, something unspeakable was happening behind closed doors. For 3 centuries, the Wren family had been hiding a secret so disturbing that when scientists finally uncovered it in 1992, they couldn't believe what they were looking at. The DNA samples didn't make sense. The genetic markers were impossible, and the physical evidence, it was something that should have never existed in modern times. Before we dive deeper into this nightmare, I need you to understand something. What you're about to hear isn't just a story about one family. It's about what happens when isolation, tradition, and desperation collide in the worst possible way. And if you think you've heard disturbing stories before, trust me, nothing will prepare you for what the Wren family was doing generation after generation. But I'll tell you this right now, if you want to understand how deep this rabbit hole goes, you need to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the evidence I'm about to present comes from sealed medical records, police reports from Austria and Kentucky, and genetic studies that were almost banned from publication. So buckle up, because we're going somewhere dark. Let's go back to the beginning. The Wren family first appeared in historical records in the village of Culderock in 1692. Back then, Scotland was a different place. Villages were isolated, roads were barely passable, and communities were small, tight-knit, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. The Wrens were farmers, nothing special, nothing remarkable. But here's where it gets strange. While other families in the region married into neighboring villages, traded with merchants from Edinburgh, and slowly integrated into wider Scottish society, the Wrens did something else entirely. They stayed, they isolated, and they only married within their own bloodline. Now you might think, okay, maybe they were just really traditional. Maybe they wanted to keep their land in the family, and sure, that's what historians thought too at first. But when genealogists started tracing the Wren family tree in the 1980s, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. For 12 consecutive generations, spanning nearly 300 years, the Wrens had been practicing systematic intermarriage. Brothers married sisters, first cousins married first cousins, and in some cases, the relationships were even closer than that. We're talking about a genetic bottleneck so severe that by the time scientists analyzed their DNA, some family members shared more genetic material than identical twins normally would with their parents. Dr. Elizabeth Howarth from the University of Edinburgh was the first geneticist to study the Wren family samples. In her 1994 paper, which was initially rejected by 3 major journals before finally being published in a specialized genetics review, she wrote something that still gives me chills. She said, and I quote, "The Wren family represents the most extreme case of sustained inbreeding ever documented in a European population. The genetic homozygosity levels are comparable only to laboratory mouse colonies specifically bred for genetic uniformity. That such a lineage could survive for 3 centuries defies our understanding of human genetic viability." But here's what really messed with scientists' heads. The Wren family didn't die out. They didn't collapse into genetic oblivion like every model predicted they should have. Instead, they grew. By 1992, when authorities finally discovered the family living in a compound of interconnected farmhouses in the remote Highlands, there were 73 living members. 73 people, all descended from the same original couple, all carrying genetic markers so intertwined that mapping their family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled web of repeating loops. Now, let me paint you a picture of what investigators found when they finally accessed the Wren compound. This wasn't like stumbling onto some primitive, uneducated community. These people had electricity, running water, and even satellite television. They were aware of the outside world. They knew what they were doing was wrong by modern standards, but they had convinced themselves through generations of reinforced belief that their bloodline was special, that keeping it pure was a sacred duty passed down from their ancestors. The family kept meticulous records, journals written in Scots Gaelic, documenting every birth, every marriage, every death. And when translators finally worked through these documents, they discovered something that made everyone involved wish they'd never opened those books. The journals described a belief system, almost religious in nature, that the Wren blood carried something unique. They believed that mixing with outsiders would dilute their strength, their intelligence, their very essence. But more disturbing than the ideology was the practical implementation. The family had developed a system. Young members were paired off by the eldest council members, always ensuring the bloodline remained concentrated. Girls as young as 14 were married to uncles, brothers, or first cousins. And if anyone tried to leave, if anyone tried to bring an outsider in, they were shunned, cast out, erased from family records as if they had never existed. This kind of thing wasn't unique to the Wrens, and that's what makes this story even more disturbing. In the isolated valleys of Austria, there's the infamous case of the Goller clan, discovered in the 1980s, where similar patterns of systematic inbreeding had been happening for generations. In the mountains of eastern Kentucky, the Fugate family became known as the Blue Fugates, because generations of inbreeding had concentrated a rare genetic condition that turned their skin blue. In rural areas of Japan, in remote regions of Iceland, in pockets of Appalachia, geneticists have documented dozens of families where geographic isolation and cultural practices created these genetic nightmares. But the Wren family was different in one crucial way. They weren't isolated by accident or by poverty. They were isolated by choice. Let me tell you about what inbreeding actually does to the human body, because this is where the science gets truly horrifying. Every human carries what geneticists call recessive genetic mutations. These are errors in our DNA that usually don't cause problems because we inherit 2 copies of every gene, one from each parent, and usually at least 1 copy is functional. But when close relatives have children, the chances that a child will inherit 2 copies of the same broken gene skyrocket. And when that happens generation after generation, these genetic disorders don't just appear. They become concentrated, amplified, inevitable. The Wren family exhibited every classic sign of inbreeding depression that geneticists had predicted but rarely seen in such concentrated form. Medical examinations revealed that over 60% of family members had some form of cognitive impairment, ranging from mild learning difficulties to severe intellectual disabilities. Physical deformities were common. Several members had cleft palates, malformed limbs, spinal curvatures that left them hunched and in constant pain. There were cases of polydactyly, children born with extra fingers or toes. There were hormonal disorders, fertility problems, immune system deficiencies that left family members vulnerable to diseases that would barely affect normal populations. But the most disturbing findings were neurological. Dr. Howarth's team discovered that many Wren family members exhibited symptoms consistent with something called inbreeding dementia, a condition so rare that it's barely recognized in medical literature. Family members would experience early onset memory loss, sometimes beginning in their 20s. They would have difficulty with spatial reasoning, with understanding cause and effect, with processing complex emotions. Some would have seizures that no medication could fully control, and in the most severe cases, there was evidence of something even darker. Several family journals described members who became violent, unpredictable, who had to be locked in basements or outbuildings for the safety of others. Now, Scottish authorities had known something was off about the Wren family for years. There were rumors in nearby villages, whispered stories about the strange people in the hills who never came to town, who never sent their children to school, who seemed to exist in a bubble separate from the rest of society. But Scotland, like many places, struggled with how to handle isolated religious or cultural communities. There's always this tension between respecting people's right to live as they choose and protecting vulnerable individuals, especially children, from harm. And for decades, that tension meant the Wrens were left alone. Everything changed in 1991 when a young woman named Margaret Wren managed to escape. She was 17 years old, and she'd been promised in marriage to her uncle, a man in his 40s who already had children with 2 other relatives. Margaret had been exposed to the outside world through contraband magazines and a hidden radio, and she knew what her family was doing wasn't normal. One night, she packed a small bag and walked 14 miles through the Highland darkness until she reached the nearest town. She walked into a police station and said 5 words that would eventually unravel 3 centuries of secrets. "My family is hurting us." The investigation that followed was unlike anything Scottish authorities had dealt with in modern times. Social workers, police, medical professionals, and geneticists descended on the Wren compound. What they found was a community living in a bizarre time warp, simultaneously modern and medieval. The family resisted at first, claimed religious freedom, claimed they were being persecuted for their beliefs. But as investigators documented the evidence, as they interviewed family members separately, as they examined medical records the family had been keeping internally, the full scope of the horror became undeniable. Children as young as 12 had been coerced into sexual relationships with adult relatives. Multiple generations of incestuous pregnancies had resulted in dozens of children with severe disabilities who received no outside medical care. Family members who tried to leave had been physically restrained, locked in rooms, psychologically abused until they submitted. This wasn't just inbreeding. This was systematic abuse masked as tradition, enforced through a combination of religious manipulation and physical control. The legal proceedings took years. Scottish law wasn't really designed to handle a case like this. How do you prosecute an entire family system? How do you distinguish between victims and perpetrators when many individuals were both? The eldest members of the family, the council that had enforced the marriage rules, were eventually convicted of various crimes including child abuse, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit sexual assault. But many family members were classified as victims themselves, people who had been indoctrinated from birth into a system they didn't have the tools or knowledge to question. The genetic analysis, though, that's what really captivated the scientific community. Dr. Howarth and her team had access to DNA samples from 73 living individuals spanning 5 generations, all of whom shared an extremely restricted genetic background. This was an unprecedented opportunity to study the effects of sustained inbreeding in humans. And what they found rewrote parts of the textbook on human genetics. First, they confirmed what everyone suspected. The level of genetic homozygosity in the Wren family was extreme. Some individuals had homozygosity levels exceeding 40%, meaning that 40% of their genetic material was identical on both chromosomes. For context, most humans have homozygosity levels between 2 and 5%. Even first, cousin marriages typically only increase this to around 6 to 8%. The Wrens had been concentrating their genetics so intensely for so long that they'd essentially created a partially cloned population. But here's what nobody expected. Despite this extreme genetic bottleneck, despite all the health problems and disabilities, the Wren family showed some unusual patterns of genetic adaptation. Certain harmful recessive mutations that should have appeared in the population had somehow been selected out. The family had suffered so many miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths over the centuries that only the relatively healthiest genetic combinations had survived to reproduce. It was evolution in fast-forward, brutal, and unforgiving. Dr. Howarth described it as genetic purging on a scale rarely observed in mammals. This created an ethical nightmare for the scientific community. On one hand, the Wren family represented undeniable evidence of human suffering caused by inbreeding. The disabilities, the shortened lifespans, the cognitive impairments, all of it argued strongly that inbreeding was harmful and should be prevented. But on the other hand, the genetic data showed that populations could, under certain circumstances, survive even extreme inbreeding through harsh natural selection. This was information that, in the wrong hands, could be misused to justify everything from eugenic policies to the continuation of isolated communities practicing systematic intermarriage. The journals kept by the Wren family elders provided another disturbing dimension to the story. These weren't ignorant people stumbling into inbreeding by accident. Multiple journal entries from the 1800s and early 1900s showed that educated family members were aware of genetic risks. They'd read scientific papers, understood Mendelian inheritance, knew exactly what they were doing. But they'd convinced themselves that the preservation of their bloodline was worth the cost. One journal entry from 1923, written by a man who had attended university in Edinburgh before returning to the family compound, literally calculated the expected increase in genetic disorders and concluded it was an acceptable sacrifice for maintaining purity. This kind of calculated cruelty, this intellectual justification for causing suffering, that's what really gets under your skin about this case. These weren't primitive people acting on superstition. These were individuals making conscious choices to perpetuate a system that harmed children, that destroyed lives, all in service of an ideology about bloodline purity that had no basis in reality. Similar patterns have emerged in other documented cases of systematic inbreeding. In Carinthia, Austria, the case of Joseph Fritzl shocked the world when it was revealed he'd kept his daughter imprisoned for 24 years and fathered 7 children with her. The genetic analysis of those children showed similar patterns of concentrated harmful mutations. In rural Pakistan, where first cousin marriages remain culturally common, geneticists have documented significant increases in genetic disorders, childhood mortality, and developmental disabilities in communities where the practice has continued for many generations. In isolated religious communities across North America, from certain Mennonite groups to fundamentalist Mormon offshoots, researchers have found pockets of rare genetic diseases that exist almost nowhere else in the world because founder effects and sustained intermarriage have concentrated these mutations. The Wren case forced geneticists to confront uncomfortable questions about human diversity and genetic health. How much genetic diversity does a population actually need to remain viable? At what point does inbreeding become inevitable catastrophe versus merely increasing risk? These questions aren't just academic. They're relevant to conservation biology, to understanding how small populations of endangered species survive, to planning for scenarios like long-term space colonization, where human populations might be isolated for generations. But let's get back to the human cost, because that's what really matters here. After the Wren compound was broken up, family members were dispersed across Scotland. Some were placed in assisted living facilities, their disabilities too severe for independent life. Younger members entered foster care or group homes, beginning the long process of learning to live in normal society. Margaret Wren, the young woman who escaped and triggered the investigation, struggled for years with PTSD and the psychological scars of her upbringing. In interviews conducted years later, she described growing up believing that the outside world was evil, that strangers were dangerous, that her family's way of life was ordained by God. Breaking free from that indoctrination was, in her words, like being born again, but into a world where nothing made sense. The medical care required for Wren family members cost the Scottish healthcare system millions of pounds. Many needed corrective surgeries for physical deformities. Others required ongoing treatment for genetic conditions that would affect them for life. Some needed psychiatric care to address the trauma of their upbringing and the abuse many had endured. And beyond the immediate healthcare costs, there were educational needs, social services, the entire apparatus of support required to integrate dozens of people who had essentially been raised in a cult into modern society. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case emerged during psychological evaluations of family members. Many of them, even after being removed from the compound and educated about genetics and the harms of inbreeding, still believed their family was special. They'd been indoctrinated so deeply that even objective evidence couldn't fully dislodge their core beliefs. Some insisted that their health problems were tests from God, trials to prove their faith. Others claimed that if they'd just been left alone, everything would have been fine. This psychological resilience of harmful beliefs, even in the face of contradictory evidence, has become a subject of study in its own right. How do you deprogram someone from beliefs that have been reinforced across multiple generations? The legal aftermath of the Wren case also raised difficult questions about culpability and justice. The eldest members of the family who enforced the inbreeding system were clearly guilty of serious crimes. But what about middle-aged family members who had been both victims as children and perpetrators as adults? What about individuals with cognitive impairments who couldn't fully understand the implications of their actions? Scottish courts struggled with these questions, ultimately taking a case-by-case approach that satisfied no one. Some victims felt that punishments were too lenient. Some advocates for the disabled felt that prosecution of impaired individuals was unjust. There were no good answers, only least bad compromises. The Wren case also sparked broader debates about individual rights versus collective welfare. In a free society, how much can we restrict people's choices about who they marry and have children with? Most modern countries have laws against first-degree incest, prohibiting sexual relationships between parents and children or between siblings. But laws about cousin marriage vary wildly. In much of the Middle East and South Asia, cousin marriage is common and legal. In parts of the United States, it's forbidden. In Europe, regulations differ country by country. The Wren case seemed to provide a clear argument for stricter laws, but civil liberties advocates worried about government overreach into private family decisions. Geneticists pointed out that even cousin marriages, while increasing genetic risks, don't guarantee disaster. The problems emerge with sustained inbreeding over multiple generations. A single cousin marriage increases the risk of genetic disorders by a few percentage points. But when every generation involves cousin marriages, when the same small genetic pool is recycled again and again, that's when genetic catastrophe becomes almost inevitable. The Wren family had essentially conducted a 300-year experiment in how far human genetics could be pushed before collapse. And the answer was grim, but not absolute. Humans can survive extreme inbreeding, but the cost in suffering, disability, and shortened lives is immense. Another angle that researchers explored was the economic dimension of inbreeding. The Wren family had kept their land consolidated for 3 centuries by never marrying outside the bloodline. This meant that the family's considerable property holdings, several hundred acres of highland farmland, had never been divided or sold. In their twisted logic, this was proof that their system worked. They'd maintained their wealth and land through a strategy that most families couldn't match. But economists who analyzed the case pointed out what this wealth had actually cost. The family had essentially paid in human suffering and potential for material stability. And even that stability was illusory. By the time authorities intervened, the family was struggling. Their isolation meant they couldn't access modern agricultural techniques. Their health problems meant many members couldn't work effectively. The land they'd fought so hard to keep was barely productive. The scientific papers that emerged from the Wren case are still cited today in genetic research. Dr. Howarth's initial publication has been referenced over 800 times in subsequent studies on topics ranging from conservation genetics to the genetic architecture of rare diseases. The Wren family DNA samples, anonymized and stored in research databases, continue to provide insights into how human genetics responds to extreme population bottlenecks. In a dark irony, the family's suffering has contributed to scientific knowledge that helps prevent similar suffering in other contexts. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of the Wren case is what it revealed about human nature's capacity for self-deception. The family elders who enforced the inbreeding system weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were people who had convinced themselves that they were preserving something precious, that their actions were justified by tradition and belief. They watched children be born with disabilities and told themselves it was God's will. They saw young people suffer and told themselves it was necessary sacrifice. This ability to rationalize harm, to construct elaborate justifications for cruelty, that's something that extends far beyond one isolated family in Scotland. Today, the Wren compound stands abandoned. The Scottish government seized the property to cover healthcare costs and legal expenses. The buildings are slowly decaying, reclaimed by the Highland wilderness. Local ghost tour operators sometimes bring visitors to look at the crumbling farmhouses from a distance, spinning sensationalized stories about the incest family that once lived there. It's become a dark tourism destination, which itself raises uncomfortable questions about how we turn human tragedy into entertainment. The surviving Wren family members have scattered across Scotland and beyond. Some have managed to build relatively normal lives, though most struggle with ongoing health issues and the psychological scars of their upbringing. A few have married and had children with unrelated partners, finally breaking the genetic curse that had haunted their bloodline for 3 centuries. Genetic counseling for these individuals is complex. They carry elevated risks for numerous recessive genetic conditions, and their potential children need careful monitoring. But compared to what they came from, having a child with someone genetically unrelated represents a massive improvement in genetic diversity. Margaret Wren, the young woman whose escape triggered the investigation, eventually wrote a memoir about her experiences. It's a difficult read, full of disturbing details about growing up in a family where sexual abuse was normalized, where children were viewed as breeding stock for maintaining bloodline purity, where any question or dissent was crushed. But it's also a story of remarkable resilience. Margaret taught herself to read beyond the limited education her family provided. She learned about genetics and evolution on her own. She came to understand that her family's beliefs were lies. And she found the courage to escape and expose the truth, knowing she would lose everything and everyone she had ever known. The Wren case forces us to confront the reality that these situations aren't just historical curiosities or foreign oddities. They happen in modern, developed countries. They happen in communities that from the outside seem normal. They happen because humans are capable of extraordinary rationalization, because isolation breeds extremism, because traditions can become prisons. And they continue happening because we as a society struggle with how to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility, with how to intervene in closed communities without being accused of persecution or cultural imperialism. There are still isolated communities around the world where similar patterns likely continue. In remote mountain valleys, on isolated islands, in insular religious groups that reject outside influence. Geneticists suspect there are families experiencing the same genetic catastrophe that befell the Wrens. But identifying these situations, intervening appropriately, and helping victims escape is extraordinarily difficult. These communities are by definition isolated and suspicious of outsiders. They often have religious or cultural justifications for their practices, and they're skilled at hiding their secrets from authorities. The Wren family story is ultimately a tragedy in the classical sense. It's about human hubris, about the belief that we can defy natural laws through willpower and conviction. The family elders thought they could maintain a pure bloodline indefinitely, that their special blood would somehow transcend the normal rules of genetics. They were wrong. And that wrongness cost hundreds of people across multiple generations their health, their potential, and in many cases their lives. Children were born into suffering because adults valued ideology over reality. And even when the truth became undeniable, even when the evidence of harm was overwhelming, the system perpetuated itself through fear, control, and indoctrination. This is what makes the Wren case so disturbing and so important. It's not just about genetics or inbreeding. It's about how belief systems, once established, can become self-perpetuating nightmares. It's about how isolation breeds extremism. It's about how humans can inflict terrible suffering while convincing themselves they're doing the right thing. And it's a reminder that these patterns aren't ancient history. They're happening right now, in communities we don't see, involving people who desperately need help but can't ask for it. The scientific community continues to study the genetic data from the Wren family, searching for insights that might help other populations facing genetic bottlenecks. Conservation biologists use this data to model the minimum viable population sizes for endangered species. Medical researchers studying rare genetic diseases examine the concentrated mutations in the Wren genome for clues about disease mechanisms. Population geneticists use the case to test theories about genetic drift and selection in small populations. The Wren family's suffering has become data, information that might help prevent similar suffering elsewhere. But we should never lose sight of the human reality behind that data. Every data point represents a person. Every genetic abnormality documented in clinical terms represented someone's lived experience of pain, confusion, and suffering. The Wren case isn't just a fascinating genetic anomaly. It's a crime that spanned centuries, a systematic abuse of vulnerable people that we as a society failed to stop for 300 years. And while we can't undo that harm, we can learn from it. We can be more vigilant. We can be more willing to question when communities isolate themselves. We can be more courageous in intervening when we suspect abuse, even when that intervention is difficult or uncomfortable. The story of the Wren family is shocking, disturbing, and deeply uncomfortable. It forces us to confront the darkest capabilities of human nature and the terrible consequences of unchecked ideology. But it's a story that needs to be told, understood, and remembered. Because somewhere right now, there's probably another isolated community, another family enforcing harmful practices in the name of tradition or belief. And somewhere, there's probably another young person like Margaret Wren, trapped in a system they didn't choose, desperately hoping for escape. The question is whether we'll notice them in time, whether we'll have the courage to intervene, and whether we'll finally learn the lesson that the Wren family's 300-year nightmare should have taught us. That some traditions don't deserve preservation, that some secrets need to be exposed, and that protecting vulnerable individuals must take precedence over respecting harmful practices. No matter how deeply rooted in tradition those practices might be.